if he can join us. I have a question I can ask, but I am happy. God, where is Christian? Should be here. He's usually.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing just now. Like he's usually.
Huh. Yeah, he didn't post any message on Discord about. Anyway, oh well.
I had one thing that was kind of stemming off from like last time, but I don't know if I can point to a particular page and say we should start here kind of thing. It's more like a vibe check. And I will say that I didn't read all the way to page 40. I got like 5 pages away and I stopped. I've not been able to fill my ADHD prescription. So I am going through withdrawals on top of the normal, not being medicated thing.
Oh my goodness, that's hard. I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it's a mug.
Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah,
we were worried we were going to have that with Liam, but we were able to get one of his per refill, but it's his is the generic. But yeah.
It's like one of those I have to call the pharmacy myself to do the thing. I'm like, isn't this someone's job? But then I feel like it's weaker. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm like calling up the pharmacies, hey man, you got any of that, methylphenidate, any of that for me? So yeah, pretty bad. But I was gonna say, I think that the some of the vibes here kind of didn't seem like that's the thing, like page 26 going forward to page 30-ish. I didn't feel as if he was like I don't think anyone could say, oh, we are Einsteinian, like Einstein's, general relativity is something that came up in my head. So we were kind of talking about that last time, space and time, matter. So it didn't seem as if like no one could like forward like, oh, what he's talking about is bullshit because science stuff. It kind of seemed to track alongside of what we kind of accepted as a base in physics. I don't know. Did anyone else think about that, or am I just like kooky?
No, I mean, I suppose so. I feel like it was like a direct criticism of idealism and more of a focus on materialism, and then kind of a criticism of intuitionism at the same time, which kind of falls into that branch.
Wait, where do you see a criticism of idealism? I place Schopenhauer as a transcendental idealist.
Really?
Yeah, he says that explicitly in one place.
There was one, I think, in 18 where he just said that they were under like some type of mystery or.
In the preface?
No, I think it was 36. Like,
I didn't get there. Shit.
35 and 36.
35 to 36. I did not get the feeling that he was a big fan of German idealism.
Yeah, so he critiques Fichte. So in his thing about the doubt of the external world that he goes on about. So he's saying that these are improper extensions of the principle of sufficient reason, and it's kind of between. So he puts Fichtean idealism as one of these improper extensions, where I think he's saying that the object is the effect of the subject, when really for him there's no causal interaction between the subject and the object. But also he kind of goes off polemically against pretty much all the major German idealists. So he mentioned Fichte briefly, but in a little bit later, he also says some things about Schelling that are kind of. He actually took some things from Schelling, but is very critical at the same time. And of course, he hates Hegel a lot.
Also, to underscore it, like he sees himself as extending and clarifying Kant. He doesn't see himself as departing very far from Kant. And Kant espoused and originated transcendental idealism. And I take Schopenhauer to take himself as a transcendental idealist in the same vein as Kant. Although
Well,
I think he's mistaken on that. I think he departs from Kant enough that he's no longer a Kantian transcendental idealist. But I don't think he sees it that way.
oops. So I screwed up those quotations in Discord, but on page 35, he explicitly says at the beginning, this is like 4 or 5 lines down, this is empirical reality. And then about little less than halfway down the page, he says the world has transcendental ideality. And so I screwed that quotation up, but I'm going to delete it. But that's exactly the same line that Kant walked: empirical reality, transcendental ideality. So he at least thinks he's doing something similar to Kant. Like you said, I'm not sure Kant would agree, but that's what Schopenhauer. So like you guys are saying, I think he's railing against certain kinds of idealism, but not idealism, completely, because he does think of himself as a kind of transcendental idealist.
Yeah, I think idealism was so thoroughly permeating the milieu at the time that I don't think it seemed possible almost to just critique idealism in general. Is there so many different types? Well, not all the idealists argue amongst each other and hate each other. I mean, not all of them, but for the most part. Yes, but he definitely thinks that he's operating within the same, he's continuing Kant's transcendental idealism critical philosophy. And he thinks that no one else is doing this. He thinks the other idealists have completely screwed up on that. Especially Hegel. It's especially Hegel. But yeah, there's definitely a lot where he's definitely diverging from Kant. But that's mainly the second book. I don't know. This first book is kind of strange because, he's giving this one-sided account, this abstract account, because he's only talking about one half of the world. Mm-hmm. And I think because of that, it kind of suffers from, I don't know, places it's kind of incoherent, in my opinion. And I think part of the reason is because of this presentation style that he gives the world as representation in the first book. And that's only one half of the world and really the more superficial half. So I think because of that, it's difficult to, there's some things that just didn't really seem to tie together. And I was thinking it's probably partly because of this.
Do you have a particular spot that we could look at that you think of, or?
Maybe 36, the one Neva was saying, the entire world of objects is and remains representation, and precisely because of this, it will and always be thoroughly conditioned by the subject. That is, the world has transcendental ideality, but this is also why the world is not a lie or an illusion. It presents itself as what is, a representation, and in fact is a series of representations bound together by the principle of sufficient reason.
Yeah, there's some place, again, I can't point to it exactly, where he says, okay, this is on page 35 toward the bottom by the number 17. On this point, I'm not sure what point. Both doctrines would be well advised to note first that representation and objects are the same thing. And second, that for objects of intuition, their being simply is their acting. So that statement, their representation and objects are the same thing. I think that's where, I don't know if any of you, I didn't consider it required reading, but if any of you read that essay by Alistair that he published in that book about Schopenhauer, one way that he gets this notion of direct realism, that for Schopenhauer, and then Alistair says he doesn't get a lot of love for that idea, that claim, but that the representation is the object. So, and on that page 35 at the top, he says this is empirical reality. So what the representations are empirical reality. They are the objects. So, this representation of this eraser, it's a representation, but it is the eraser. I mean, that's what it is.
Yeah, because even on like further down from the line I read, I mean, it was kind of searing. Like, I like reading him because he's like both. I feel like he's eloquent, but also kind of I don't know what the word I'm looking for, like instigating in a way to the like this part, to those with common sense, this is how the world is, even if its innermost meaning is comprehensible and speaks a language of utter clarity. Only a mind distorted by sophistry would think to argue about its reality, and when that does happen, it's always the result of an invalid application of the principle of sufficient reason. So there does seem to be a direct tie to direct realism to him. I don't know. I'd be curious to read more if he even makes an appeal to materialism. But
well, he kind of does, but I think, I've been reading some other stuff too, from the Cambridge Companion and such. So I forget what came from where, but that, he can think of himself as a kind of materialist in a sense, but it's materialism kind of in the sense of that direct realism idea that, this is a material object, but it's also a representation. So the world of representation is the world of materiality, because he uses the word, he uses the word matter a lot in this section, right? But matter, so it's a kind of materialism because everything that we can experience is matter. But then matter, what is matter? Well, it's cause and effect. And I'm not even sure exactly what that means. I mean, it sounds almost to me like things are constituted by their relations to one another, rather than, by their, substantial being. I mean, I think there was a place in here where it sounds like he was just kind of giving an interpretation of the second analogy, because he was talking about, this is on page 31, where he's talking about how we can get the notion of duration and substance, through these causal relations. But it seems like what's really primary there in matter or material bodies are, as he says, matter reveals its origin in time through quality, accident, and matter is action. Matter is activity. So he seems to be, giving us, I don't know what, a dynamic interpretation of matter in a sense.
But yeah, I think the dynamism is huge. I think you're right.
But is it 7 lines, 8 lines down, where he says, but this is not the only reason why we must emphatically deny the dogmatist declaration that the external world is real apart from the subject. The dogmatist is also wrong because it is impossible to consistently think any object at all apart from the subject. I thought that was the whole gist of it, that objects don't exist without a subject for something to apprehend it.
But I don't think that's consistent with what I said.
Well, okay. Well,
did he mention Heraclitus too?
But if it doesn't exist outside of an apprehension of it, that doesn't. What's the referent that he's referring to?
Well,
he's saying that an object can't exist without someone apprehending it. Well, then what is it? I mean, so before there was any kind of humanoid creatures running around the planet, stars didn't exist?
Well, I don't think this is the way. I don't think what I'm going to say is the way Schopenhauer is going to go, because in book 2 he's going to bring in the world as will. But just as this is sort of something you hear phenomenologists say, and this, there's places in here where Schopenhauer to me sounds a lot like a phenomenologist, and actually in that article on direct realism, Alistair makes a case. He invokes Husserl and Heidegger to make similar points. But if you say, so when you say, what is the world apart from any subjective experience? That's sort of an appeal to what Kant called transcendental realism. In other words, there is some reality that transcends subjectivity, that exists apart from subjectivity. But what a phenomenologist would ask is, or might ask is, does the word object, or the concept, the idea of object, or even the word being, or the word exist, do those terms have any meaning at all apart from some subject experiencing that and saying that? So, for example, I can say this pen exists, and if you ask, well, what is the pen apart from my experience of it? That's a meaningless question, because the word exist and the word being literally have meaning only for an entity that can have an experience of this thing. So, I think that's the sort of fundamental phenomenological move that at least Schopenhauer is pointing to, is that the very notion of existence in itself, the very idea of being, the very idea of a thing, only has meaning. We perceptive creatures, subjects, are the ones who come up with those terms, come up with those ideas, generate those meanings, and they only have meaning in the world of a subject that gives meaning to those terms. And so in that sense, the world of objects only exists and only has meaning for creatures that can experience that. If you ask, what is the world on the other side of my subjective experience? There are people who've been tried to answer that, but I think a phenomenologist would say that's an unintelligible question. You're asking, what is the world like, independent of any subjective consciousness? And there is no such world. You can misuse the language. In fact, even when you say something like, what does it mean for something to be outside of the subjective awareness of it? The word be only has meaning in the context of a subject having an experience of this thing. So the word be doesn't even have meaning. The word thing doesn't have meaning independently of some subjective, some subject experiencing it. And so again, at best, it's an unintelligible question, at least according to the phenomenologists. That's why, people like Schopenhauer and Kant will say transcendental realism, you're talking about things you can't possibly make any sense of at best.
I thank you for saying all that, Nev, because I realize what the issue is. If I understood you correctly, you used the term meaning and existence, and you put them together as seeming to mean the same thing from the point of view of Schopenhauer and the phenomenologists.
Well, what is the meaning of the word exist? What does that word mean? It can't mean what something is like independently of my, of a conscious being experiencing it, because that very word exist is a word that a subject produced to explain something that appears in that subject's experience. So the meaning of the word exist doesn't have any meaning. I mean, it doesn't have any meaning outside a subject's experience.
Then we really should never use the word discover.
Not if you mean discover stuff that's outside of our possible human experience.
Well, doesn't the word and concept discover presuppose the existence of things
Well,
independently of some sentient being's observation of it?
Not on these guys' view.
Well,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that Heidegger to be, for example, Heidegger talks about truth as like revealing, as in like you're turning a page. You imagine, you have something under here and you're bringing light to it by flipping it. Discovery is merely that action, in some sense. But yeah, I think the phenomenologist bit here. I want to say, like, another thing is that, like, I think the phenomenologist reading is a pretty compelling reading, just because of the way that the prose come across. I was thinking about it on page like 28, for example. I don't know if we want to like discuss whether to try to settle the debate whether he's a phenomenologist or not, or proto-phenomenology, but I think that it may help in approaching the text some, if that's.
What I'm thinking is we could use that as sort of a, what's the word, heuristic? And
Yeah.
And then if it turns out that we find evidence to the contrary, we can say, well, that was wrong.
Yeah, but I don't know. There's this, we should talk about like time on page 28, that first full page. Readers who clearly see from my introductory essay that the principle of sufficient reason has a unified content in spite of its different forms. We also will be convinced how important cognition of the simplest of those forms, which we have identified as time, is for an insight into their own innermost essence. They will be convinced that each moment in time exists only insofar as it has annihilated the previous moment, its father, only to be annihilated just as quickly in its turn. And that last sentence in particular, I thought that the prose on that was very, phenomenologically, if you try to grab onto time and the way that he's describing it there, it seems to kind of be demonstrative. The sentence seems to be demonstrative of the phenomena that it's an accurate description, is what I guess I'm trying to say. I don't think it's controversial, but I don't know. Does that help the phenomenologist like claim here or no?
So that sentence, they will be convinced that?
Yeah, like starting there and then running to, I guess, the next sentence. So the next two sentences. Because as soon as he brings in Heraclitus in that whole big block, or that page, that's where the Heraclitus bit is too.
So he keeps citing relative existence. Let's see. We'll also recognize the same unreality and all the other forms of the principle of sufficient reason. We will see that it is, as it is with time, so it is with space, and as it is with space, so it is with everything else, everything that is in both space and time. Everything, therefore, that arises from cause or motive exists only relatively, exists only through and for something else similar to itself, something that has only the same relative existence. Thinking they're relative to what? I guess things only exist insofar as they are related to other things of the same kind.
Yeah, I remember him saying specifically that matter only interacts with other matter
Hmm.
in the same way objects. So the principle of sufficient reason for causality that only operates uh, among objects. So they have to be at least the same object type. He has I think, some different types of objects. But yeah, I think I mean, that's makes sense. You know, it's otherwise you'd have the kind of this problem of interaction kind of going on where you have two things of different types, then how do they interact? Um, which I think is still a problem here as far as what is this relation of the subject and the object? It can't be causal. He talks about it as like a correlation, but what exactly is that? How are they correlated? You know, it's
Well,
one of many
Yeah, I
things.
s-
Doesn't he also slip into causal talk in terms of the relationship between the subject and the object? Because the subject knows the object as the effect of a cause, the object
Yeah.
is the cause of the effect.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
only if knowing involves a kind of causation, which he denies.
Yeah, I feel like he's being a little inconsistent. But
Well,
I'm
why is that inconsistent?
Is it? Go.
well, properly in the Kantian doctrine, we're not supposed to think of phenomena as effects of the cause, which is the thing in itself. And he's not setting it up like that, and he's arguing against that. But then elsewhere, he seems to talk about we know that they're objects because they are the effects of which the cause is the effects on our senses have a cause in the object.
But our senses are still objects. I mean, our senses are tied to the immediate object, namely the body.
Mhm.
And so the senses, you know, the way that we know causes in the world is because of because they impact our body in various ways. And the body is he's explicit, is a physical object in a world of objects. And so the body is interacting causally. And the subject, to me, it seems like he's saying the subject is this because you have no knowledge of the subject. It's kind, I mean, it's a kind of, I don't know if he'll ever say this, but it's a kind of transcendental subject because it's a subject that seems aware of objects and causation and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if he's going to say that understanding, maybe he does say if understanding is a faculty of the subject, I don't know, but and maybe time and space are a faculty of the subject as well. So maybe the subject is functioning something like a transcendental ego, but that the subject is kind of the ground of awareness.
We're not to go too far back because I know we're on 32, but I have highlighted where he says, I considered space and time as a special autonomous group of representation insofar as they are pure intuitions without content on 27, which I thought was interesting because he seems to, I don't know Kant well enough to from what I understood of Kant, space and time was kind of a priori perception, whereas he seems to be saying it's kind of grounded into the subject with some form of intuition. And then on 30, even though we're on 32, the law of causality does not determine the succession of states simply in time, but in fact determines the succession with respect to a particular space, and it does not determine the existence of states in a particular location, but in fact in this location at a particular time. Which to me, I have a note back to how he described time on 28, which is page 28. They will be convinced that each moment in time exists only insofar as it has annihilated the previous moment, its father, only to be annihilated just as quickly in turn. They will be convinced that past and future, setting aside the consequences of their contents, are as unreal as any dream, that they present that the present is only the border between the two, and so neither has extension or duration. So it seems like time is tied kind of in a way to the being, and that he's saying it's not necessarily an a priori, perception, but maybe more of an intuition, and that he seems to be saying that causality, mainly from what I interpret it as, that causality is being confused for logic.
I think he explicitly says that both space and time, I think he's following Kant here, are a priori forms of empirical intuition, and that they are themselves intuitions.
Without content, is that why he says I consider space and time a special autonomous group of representations insofar as they are pure intuitions without content?
Yeah, and by that I think he just means they're pure, that they are pure intuitions prior to any empirical experience, but that empirical experience of objects can only exist within that temporal spatial framework, but that space and time themselves are these a priori intuitions.
Right.
But then
So
he,
think back when Kant was saying we can imagine empty space, a space devoid of objects. We can't imagine objects sans space or time. Space or time are unique, a special class, or a special autonomous class of intuitions, precisely because they're needed for all other intuitions. But we can have them alone, autonomous, right? We can have them alone. You can imagine empty space. You don't need objects to imagine space, but you do need space to imagine objects in space.
Yeah, I think he's following Kant somewhat closely here, actually. He's got different accounts in some cases on as far as the principle of sufficient reason and all that, but I think that part, at least on time, I think he's following Kant pretty closely.
I think on the nature of space and time, he follows Kant very closely. I think on the nature of causality, he departs from Kant somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he gets rid of all the categories and basically puts them in the principle of sufficient reason, but that kind of the main category of or I don't know what to call it, the aspects, I don't know, the elements of principles of sufficient reason. One of the main ones is causality, which I think that at least governs the intuition of objects, and that goes along also obviously with space and time and sensibility and whatnot. So one thing though that I thought was interesting is that so this is actually I think one section ahead of what we were supposed to read to, but
always got to overachieve, Chase.
I don't know about that. But he's saying, okay, yeah, the body's the immediate object. And he's saying that the alterations that the body undergoes, that gives it sense data. And that's kind of where then you get understanding from. And then understanding, you get matter, proper objects, as he says, versus an immediate object. So causality, in a sense, would come after this kind of affects, these pure sensations he talks about. I think that is very difficult to conceive about how that works, in the sense that there's some kind of alteration going on with bodies and affects, but yet that is being described as kind of at least the condition of the category of causality kind of emerges from that. And so kind of back to one of the earlier points about, causal language and how he seems to be using these to describe, causation itself in some cases. I think part of it is because he's constantly using these transcendental arguments where he's talking about something conditioning something. But I think at least Schopenhauer, he would say that that's not the same as causality, of course, but he's giving an explanation for something. The condition of something is in this. I think that's part of the problem, is that it's causation. He's using a very specific, limited use of it. And even, I think this is true for a lot of things he talks about with the understanding and intuition in general. Where okay, so his idea about objects. Okay, well, that's proper objects. That's the object that the subject can cognize and understand the causal effect and trace that and whatnot. But then there's also immediate objects. And so where does that distinction ultimately come from? It can't come from a cause. So once we try to talk about, okay, why is this? What is the reason for this argument? How can we talk about that if we can't talk about, okay, this is the cause of that? So we have to kind of limit our idea of causality to just kind of the way that he delimits it. And I think that's just difficult to do, because it requires, in a way, kind of having to learn his whole kind of system and then apply it. And that's, it's difficult, but I think in a lot of ways that's kind of what he's doing. And also that's why he doesn't really seem to want to give really distinct arguments sometimes. And it kind of operates by kind of tautological, if not circular reasoning, in that he's saying that, okay, no, that can't be the case, because objects can only be a representation, and a representation requires a subject. But that argument, something like that, works because you're presupposing that indeed the object is the representation, and that presupposes the subject. So it's kind of like he's laying it out, but then saying, oh yeah, look at my previous book. And
essay,
yeah.
She forgot essay.
The introductory essay.
By the way,
and then you'll totally get it. But until then, I've got the system, and you've got to just kind of like follow it, including the fact that objects are representations. Representations are representations for a subject, and all that. Where it's kind of like, okay, yeah, if you presuppose that, all these things are indeed the case, then that follows, because it's just a tautology at that point. But there's a lot of confusing things going on with exactly how he's using these conditioning kind of arguments, but then doing that to kind of talk about ultimately something happening that gives us causality. But then I don't know. It's difficult to understand what is going on in a lot of cases here. Where's the outside for Schopenhauer with a capital O? It seems like he wants to say that it's pure sensation, but then doesn't that require time, space, causality, all the things that he just put in a very delimited subject? I don't know. Okay, rant over.
No, I it's a really good question, because I'm struggling with that a lot. Like, I don't know if he's even saying we can access the O. Like, if it's, I know. Sorry.
Access what?
The O, the other. I'm sorry, maturity of a 12-year-old. Thanks. The because like on 33 says only when the understanding proceeds from the effect, well, furthermore, further back, what the eye and the ear and the hand sense is not an intuition, it's merely data. And only when the understanding proceeds from the effect back to the cause is the world present in intuition, where he uses the word intuition and seems to string causality to it. And then spread out in space, its form capable of change, its matter persisting throughout all time, because the understanding unites space and time in the representation of matter, i.e. activity. And I have a note saying go back to 28, page 28, where he says, we will see this on, this is like the middle of page 20. We will see that it is with time, so it is with space. As it is with space, so it is with everything, that it is both space and time. Everything, therefore, that arises from cause or motive exists only relatively, exists only through and for something else similar to itself, something that has only the same relative existence. In essence, this view is ancient. We see it in Heraclitus, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing that, when he bemoans the eternal flux of things in Plato's disparaging account of objects as eternally becoming but never being. And then he makes a reference to Spinoza. So I'm wondering if he's kind of like, it's almost like, in a way, it's like an intrinsic form of realism, or like a combination, like maybe that's where he is with Kant, where of like, there is some transcendentalism, but it's really nothing we have access to, and the world is in this constant shifting flux, that's the only thing that we can relatively experience at that moment and have language or talk about objectively.
Is the flux?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my
Wasn't
sense,
there I'm sorry, Nevitt, wasn't there a word that Nietzsche had for that when it came to the world or metaphysics for Nietzsche, always everything moving, kind of similar to her, like not the Hegelian flux, but like Heraclitus? I can't remember. You had mentioned it.
Becoming.
yeah, I can't
Like,
think of anything besides flux. Yeah,
I wish I would have wrote it
nothing
down.
comes to mind right now.
I have, when I do these, I have notes that I write, and I left it on my old laptop. Damn it. All right.
So my sense is that the body collects these sensations, but the sensations are not sensations of things. They're just like raw data. And then the mind processes that data in terms of space and time. And then the understanding adds to it cause and effect. And that's when you have objects. And so, and then following, I wish Alistair was here, because Alistair was saying that, when that passage, that stuff we were reading from Kant, that intuition referred to intuition of particulars. And so I'm assuming that Schopenhauer is using it in the same way or a similar way, so that we do not experience particular objects until our, what Kant would call the manifold of sensation, but until this raw sensory data to which we have no direct access, this raw sensory data is processed by space and time and by causality. And for Schopenhauer, like in that quote, like Chase was saying, Schopenhauer, I don't know if he ever says anymore, but at this stage, he throws out all the categories of the understanding except for cause and effect. He explicitly says, I put that quote up there, that's all the understanding does, is it just arranges things in terms of cause and effect. And so what the sense I get is it's like Kant, in the sense that you have this flux, this manifold of sensibility that then is processed by space and time and by the understanding, aka cause and effect. And as a result of that processing, you have representations, you have intuitions of objects in a world.
Maybe does that lie in 35, where he says on this point, both doctrines would be well advised to note first that the representation and the object are the same thing, and second, that for objects of intuition, their being simply is in their acting?
Yeah, I think so. I'll be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on what he means by he keeps saying matter is action, objects
Yeah.
are their activity, and I'm still struggling with that a bit. I've been trying to cash out in terms of that notion of it, of it's all about cause and effect, and that objects are something like constituted by their the multiplicity of their causal interactions or something. But that's the closest I can come to understand what he means by acting is what constitutes the actuality of a thing.
Can you imagine a substance that doesn't act on anything else? How would you know it? How would you recognize it? How would you, I mean, you can't bump into it. You know what I mean? Like, what things in the world that we call material can we take all causal powers away from completely? If it's extended in space, it at least has the power to displace.
And then maybe, since he talks about the body a lot, maybe specifically, like you said, how would I know it? Well, I wouldn't be able to have an experience of an object unless it interacts causally with my body in some way. So that's, I guess, it's action, that it's interacting literally with
Right.
my body.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine matter that's incapable of any type of action whatsoever. You know what I mean? Even like if it's extended, it must be able to displace. If it can't act on any other bodies at all, then how would we know about it? How would we even conceive of it?
But
I guess that's why I lean more towards him being a materialist, but you guys are saying he isn't.
Well, he is a kind of materialist. I mean, people say Hegel is a materialist. So
I would dispute calling either Schopenhauer, Kant, or Hegel materialists, though I would grant they have moments where they want to incorporate material reality into their system, but their system is tied together with ideality. It's like the structure of the system is idealism, although it's not, here's the thing, it's not pure subjectivism, right? And I wish I had read Beiser more recently and then I could bring him up, but Beiser has a good book about Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel reacting against subjectivism. They're idealists, yes, but they're not subjectivists.
yeah, he said, this is the bottom of page 34. In section 5, he's talking about Fichte. Fichte's idealism, Fichtean idealism, makes the object into an effect of the subject. Whether he's right or not about that, that would be subjective idealism, right? Where the object is literally a creation of the subject. He's not saying that. He's saying, I am not Fichte.
Right. I think that was also the danger for Berkeley. The reason why Berkeley had a flash of insight, but the whole of his philosophy, hell no. Because the whole of his philosophy leans so much towards that subjectivism.
As a pin note,
go ahead.
do we actually think he gets Fichte right there or no? Like,
I'm not sure.
I don't know if I don't think he does per se, but that's just based on the handful of things that I've read. But yeah, I don't know if he gets the Fichte right there actually.
I think that's an extreme. I think there's a lot of subtlety missing in that statement.
Yeah, I think he's just being an ass right there. That's just that's his personality coming out.
He does that a lot.
am I understanding y'all correctly of your interpretation of Schopenhauer that the experiencing of an object by a subject, begging your pardon for using the word exists because the subject can represent it? I would use the word conceptualize it, because that's what you seem to be having a tendency to say that, but I might be hearing something you're not saying.
So I think again, maybe I'm borrowing too much from phenomenology. But I think Schopenhauer would endorse this. Every object exists for a subject. yeah, that's sort of a central phenomenological thesis. Every object exists for a subject. To talk about an object independently of a subject is to talk about something that we can make no possible sense of.
Sure. I get that. But what I'm saying is I'm thinking of a child, a toddler who sees a butterfly for the first time. The child doesn't know the word insect, doesn't really have, it's not talking yet, right? Or just nonsense syllables. Doesn't know the word insect, bug, butterfly, whatever. The child can still visually experience the butterfly without being able to conceptualize it.
And
Go ahead.
That right there is consistent with Schopenhauer, because one of the things he does is he makes this explicit distinction between conceptualization and intuition. And intuition is non-conceptual, but he still calls it intellectual, which is confusing. But I think he calls it that because the understanding, which is nothing more than linking things together in cause and effect, does not require conceptualization. And in the next section, he actually says animals have the understanding.
It's page 27. I think that's where he starts with that on page 27, the part 3, where he like makes the distinction between concepts.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
At the very top.
So, I mean, to extend that, Ed, yeah, the child is experiencing an object. The child is experiencing a butterfly, but the child is not experiencing the butterfly as a butterfly. And if none of us ever had the concept of insect or butterfly, then we would constantly be experiencing these things, but we wouldn't experience them as the butterflies that we know them as today, unless we develop these empirical concepts of insect and butterfly. But that's consistent with Schopenhauer and Kant. Like, we can experience objects while being mistaken, or what kinds of objects we might, or how to properly classify them in a scientific scheme.
So Kant would be okay with that idea as well?
Yeah, it would still be an object. I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's just all you need for Kant to constitute an object is intuition brought together under the table of categories. The table of categories does not include a biological taxonomy, right? If you look at the table of categories, these are much more fundamental concepts than insect, butterfly.
They're very abstract.
Right. Yeah.
Would Kant? Do you know if Kant would say animals have categories of the understanding?
I would. I don't know. I don't know how much he would extend
I think
understanding to the animals. I think somewhat, but not to this. I mean, probably understanding, but not reason. But,
well, that's exactly what Schopenhauer's doing. He's saying the animals have understanding, but not reason.
Right.
So there's one thing I was reading, actually by Alistair, and it was, so he made the point specifically that Schopenhauer grants more cognitive ability to animals than Kant does. I'm not exactly sure what Kant, what he would extend to animals exactly, because he says, I'm talking about humans. I'm leaving that there. So at least as far as I know, he's not saying exactly that, animals are dumb and whatnot. But I think he's just kind of being like, I'm not dealing with that question. At least what I've read, where Schopenhauer specifically is making a novel claim with the way that he's extending understanding to all animals and plant life as well, and like somewhat actually to kind of inorganic objects as well.
Really?
So
what exactly so I'm lost here. Like, what exactly in the text are we looking at? Because I just want to make sure that I have this.
I'm thinking we've moved past the reading for today. Is that correct?
That's I was
Yep.
trying to get there. I was like, I don't know, man. Like, hold on.
The next section, I mean, I've read only one thing ahead, more as a matter of time management. He does talk about animals there specifically.
Yeah, it's in section 6. But
Interesting. Okay.
Oh, so
the
like
idea
very
is,
next section.
yeah, it's kind of the same thing that wait, Note just explained. The distinction between, concepts using reason, that's the faculty of reason, is conceptual for Schopenhauer. So that's different from Kant. But yeah, he'll talk about that some more. But yeah, so animals don't have conceptual understanding, but they have this immediate intuition of space and time and understanding that is intellectual, that allows them to grasp causality and therefore objects and activity and whatnot. And I think that obviously makes sense. Like your cat, your dog, butterflies can sense objects. They've got some understanding of causality, although, yeah, it's probably not very conceptual, which I think it makes sense to me, that part. Yeah.
It's
Although he
easy.
says, yeah, there's differences in degrees between, humans, as far as we know, are at the highest degree of acumen for the understanding. And then at the very bottom, I think, would be inorganic objects that can only kind of just replicate stimulus response kind of thing, where we can actually have instead kind of understand causality and work within that. And that's what he thinks kind of the intellect is grasping causation in all of its subtlety. And stupidity is the lack of ability to understand causality. It's kind of makes sense.
One of the things, a story I tell my students when we're talking about Hume is we don't have a dog now, but our last dog, I trained him to, when it was time to eat, I would make him sit on his bed and then go across the room into the kitchen and pour food into his bowl. And he would have to sit on his bed and wait until I said free, and then he could run across the room and eat. But after doing that for a long time, what he started doing is he would go over and sit on his bed and wag his tail and look at me. And he seemed to figure that he got the correlation, sitting on the bed produces food, but in his little doggy brain, it was like literally sitting on the bed makes the man feed me. And so, I think that's maybe a good illustration. He does get the cause and effect thing, but he doesn't get it conceptually. He can't think about it very effectively.
I've got her trained to sit in a specific spot and make eye contact with me. Otherwise, I don't scoop her food. And then I don't scoop her food unless she's maintaining the eye contact. Like, I'll go there, but I won't scoop. And then keep the eye contact. And then when I put it in the bowl, she knows that she has to keep the eye contact. And I give her either, free. Free is one of the release words. And then it's so cute. She bounds and jumps at it like it's going to fly away. You're like 5 feet away from the thing, but it's like about to run away. So she's well trained. When she's hungry, she goes and stands and looks at the bag, and then looks at me.
There you go.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, for the question on whether or not this is a huge deviation from Kant, I think I don't know, for the people interested, Christine Korsgaard would be the one probably to go to read up on Kant's animal, or extending Kant's philosophy in animals and ethics and whatnot. So that's just a side kind of note. That's to be the person to kind of confirm that with. I know that Schopenhauer is just going to kind of like, it's red in tooth and claw, like, with nature per se on the ethics kind of thing. But
Kant
okay. I see where we're going with the animal stuff. Okay, cool. That's
Kant himself says that animals are things, not persons, and so that you can use them any way you wish. So, I haven't read Korsgaard, but from what you and Eric and others have said, they're trying to revise Kant to come up with a more compassionate view of animals while staying within his general system.
Do you think he's laying the groundwork for like the potentiality within immanence in a transcendental system here?
What do you mean by immanence?
Like that you have access to the thing directly, and in that thing having so many different interactions, like with the external world and with the object and us as the person interacting with it, because of the, I don't know, like because of us being able to access it, it's either going to, we have limitless potential, like that when I say immanence, like the thing, like access to the thing in and of itself, we can either have, it's kind of like a Spinozian aspect where there's all of this potentiality of what we can access within the object that we're perceiving, or we're either going to be jailed into it in almost a deterministic sense. I'm kind of curious to see where he goes with this. So if I say immanence, I mean like somehow from a philosophical, how am I going to define immanence from a philosophical sense? And not because I only heard it in the theological, but in the philosophical, I was thinking more of like a Deleuzian concept of it, like the potentiality of accessing the object directly in almost a transcendental way. Does that make sense?
Immanence is a very hard concept to describe. I'll just say that. But I think probably the best way I would attempt to answer that question, I would say you probably need to wait until book 2 when he gives the deduction of the will, because there he's going to make an argument from a kind of I'm not sure exactly what faculty exactly this would be, that we directly apprehend in the immediate object of our body, the will, which is also where we are aware that it's a representation. So your body is this kind of, it's a privileged epistemic zone of immanence, maybe, perhaps, for both aspects of the representation and the will, but specifically your own body.
Well, and that's where I'm really curious where he goes with that, with the will and his idea of if you can even say he has an idea of immanence. I was just thinking perhaps he does. It's either going to be limitless potential or it's going to be a prison, depending on how you define the will.
Prison.
Prison. That's where I was going to go. Schopenhauer is probably going to be prison.
Okay.
Yeah, Schopenhauer is a prison guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Prison.
You know, as they say, if you want a jury hour, spend some time with Schopenhauer.
Right.
So,
And
I
also,
kind of like him. I don't know. I really am enjoying him.
also, it's a bit premature, but since we're already kind of jumping towards that will, I think it's important to bear in mind it's not a individual subjective will, except in the most immediate sense, right? But investigation leads us to recognize that there is one unifying will undergirding everything.
I think if you want a really short intro, read Beyond Good and Evil 36 by Schopenhauer. I'm sorry, by Nietzsche.
Nietzsche?
Yeah.
When you say 36, the section
30,
of it or the page?
No, section 36.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, shut up. Sorry, I'm not telling you to shut up. Siri's talking to me over here.
I thought I heard
Siri.
yeah.
To like babble off the section when you say it. She just like pops
Yeah,
up.
like in class sometimes Siri starts going, wow. But in Beyond Good and Evil 36, Nietzsche repeats a very Schopenhauerian notion of how to of experiencing the will directly within one's own being. So
Yeah. And then The Birth of Tragedy, of course, was
Hmm.
written under influence of Schopenhauer, although you can already see that Nietzsche is quite unique in his thinking even then. So I just went over it some yesterday. I don't even know why. And I was thinking of some of the Schopenhauerian kind of elements he adds to it seem kind of forced. I don't know if I'm kind of retroactively looking at it, but I don't know. It's kind of, I guess, beside the point. But so yeah, the will is so this is another one of these kind of conundrums I think that is going on in terms of, is it individual? Is it not? So the will in itself is not individuated. There's no number involved. Why? Because those are aspects of the principle of sufficient reason. You can only make these individual distinctions within representation. So they can't be within the will. So the will in itself, there's no number, there's no numerical differentiation or distinction. But the will, as we have access to it in the immediate object of our body, is at least refracted through a kind of individual apparatus. So in that sense, it is actually kind of individuated, which seems kind of difficult to, okay, so how does that come about? I don't know. Can you even talk about something coming about or the genesis of anything because that's obviously going to be thinking then, terms of causality and activity and interaction and time. Yeah. So
I think I don't know. Maybe he
Go ahead.
drops the whole origins thing. That's something that I mean, it makes sense. I don't know.
Would it be helpful to draw an analogy to like vitalism? Like life, capital L, life force, if you want to do capital L, capital F, but each one of us is an individuated life or an individuated life force participating in capital L, capital F life force.
Yeah, I think something like that is definitely what he's getting into. So I think in order for this to work, you have to say, okay, yeah, the will then in itself has to have some kind of something about it that makes it where it individuates. It does that, even though it itself is not individuated. But I think really, probably one of the best cases of this is, Spinoza. So, you got substance, and substance has modes. The modes are distinct from substance, but also in some sense are substance. They're, expressions of substance. They're modes. They're modifications of substance. So I think something like that is also operating with, the will. You got the will. That's kind of the ground, although he doesn't want to say that at all. The ground, that's something within causality, ground consequent relations. So it's not that kind of relation, but it's some kind of expressive relation like that. But I guess that kind of goes into the whole immanence thing, because that's kind of the challenge of philosophy, would be kind of how do we make those immanent where it makes sense. Does Schopenhauer accomplish it? I'm not sure, but yeah.
Forgive me, I have to leave shortly because I'm picking up a dog for dog sitting. So I've enjoyed this greatly, though. I missed you guys. Farewell.
Take care. Enjoy dog.
Oh yeah, Luna's the best. She's a pit bull or French bulldog, so she's so cute. I'll send pictures to the Discord. Anyway, bye guys.
So if those of you who seem to really understand what he's been saying in this section we were supposed to read for tonight, if you were going to give me the most important takeaway from it, what would you say?
Hmm.
Or takeaways. I don't want to be one of those people that just says one thing.
You know,
So-
put it like put it on a bumper sticker, and he's like, he wrote the big fat text. You know, it's
Yeah, right. He writes
Right.
this. I want you to put it on a bumper sticker. No, really. I mean, but I mean, if you think there's multiple, whatever, I don't want to put a limit.
You know, for me, I think the big ideas are subject object, that there is no objective world without a subject to experience it. And then the a priori role of space, time, and causation. And causation, I don't know what to say, is made possible by the understanding. So there's and of space and time, you know, like Chase was saying, it seems to me he's pretty much just going after Kant there, and so, you know, following Kant and saying you can't have any kind of empirical experience unless it is in space and time. And so space and time, in some sense, must be available prior to any kind of empirical experience. So space and time are a priori. They are conditions for the possibility of having an empirical experience. And there, I think he's just following Kant. And then the understanding is also something that must already be in place prior to experience. And understanding is what links things together, objects of experience together through cause and effect. And it's those three, space and time and causality, which make possible the subject's experience of a world of things. That's my basic summary.
So would you consider space and time to be unique concepts in the Schopenhauer's understanding? Meaning, because you said a priori, but the other gist of it seemed to be the object can't exist without the subject perceiving it. But a priori, doesn't a priori mean by definition, you know, before?
Yeah, so what I don't yet understand is the relationship between the subject and space, time, and understanding. You know, so Kant is pretty explicit about that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but Kant talks about a subject that does not appear within experience. That subject is the transcendental ego. Transcendental just means not available to my empirical experience. And so there's this subject that lies behind. So Eric wants to quibble about that one. There's a subject that lies, in a sense, behind my experience. And then space and time and the categories of the understanding are features of the way the transcendental subject organizes experience. What I don't know yet is whether Schopenhauer is going to make the same kind of move, because so far all he's talked about is and it does seem to be a transcendental subject, because he says you can't experience it. And so he's talked about a transcendental subject, and he's talked about space, time, and causality, but he hasn't, at least that I've seen, he hasn't yet said, linked up those two, the transcendental subject and space, time, and causality. Kant explicitly links them up. I'm less sure. I mean, I'm guessing Schopenhauer is, but I'm not sure. So Eric, correct my errors, if you would.
When you said transcendental just means not available to experience, I would say that that's a consequence of Kant's meaning, but strictly what I mean by transcendental is a condition for the possibility of experience whatsoever. So in order for us to have experience, this must be the case. So it's a transcendental condition for any possible experience whatsoever. Also, I wanted to just kind of correct a bit on the terminology. For Kant, and I think this is also true for Schopenhauer, space and time are not concepts. at least in the first instance. We can, I want to say Kant later says, we can form empirical concepts of time and space, but this is only because we already have time and space as pure forms of intuition. However, for Kant, cause is a category, which is a privileged type of concept. And the way Schopenhauer seems to be setting this up, it seems that cause isn't quite a concept. It seems to fit with time and space on the side of intuition. And not, but I think that's, even that what I just said is a little bit too ham-fisted and moving Schopenhauer away from Kant. I don't know if he makes that bold of a move in that way, but it does seem to shade, cause does seem to, I mean, he probably still thinks of it a concept, but it does seem to shade closer to intuition, the way he sets it up.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, it seems like, as near as I can tell, he's following Kant pretty much straightforwardly in terms of space and time, but then understanding and cause, that seems to me where he's beginning to move in a bit of a different direction. I can't exactly pin how, but yeah, I think that's a different, he's doing something a bit different there.
Yeah, so he talks about the understanding is the entirety of causality, you know. Never just put this quote in there. To have cognition of causality is the understanding's only function, its single capability. So yeah, that's where he's definitely doing something a little different from Kant there, although it's still obviously influenced by Kant at the same time. So it's kind of tricky. But yeah, I think that's a good point. So yeah, space and time, those are forms of intuition, a priori forms. I think that's what Kant is saying too. But instead of these categories being applied to every experience in order as a priori conditions of there being an experience and it being cognizable and whatnot, he's going to instead say that's all that can be collapsed and either kind of distance and say, okay, that's abstract stuff, this conceptualization. But we have this intuitive understanding that is this grasp of the principle of sufficient reason, or specifically in causality, which is the reciprocal actions of matter that are subject also to this kind of combination of space and time. So, yeah, it's pretty similar to Kant, definitely. But like I was saying, yeah, still a little distinct. What else was I gonna say? Oh yeah. So another thing, as far as the subject and how that deals with all these certain things, that also I think I found that definitely confusing. And I'm trying to remember so I previously read excerpts of this book in the class I took, and I'm trying to remember, it was, the will isn't the subject. The will is definitely not the subject. And he'll have, so in the third book, he'll have this take on, so it follows this kind of a 4-part, sectioning where you have the world as representation, first consideration. That's what we're on now. And then as will, the world as will, first consideration, that's going to be the next book, introduces the will. Then the third is the world as representation, second consideration. And that's where he's going to talk about art and more like aesthetic experience. And he'll have some interesting things to say there because he sees that as a kind of collapse of the subject-object distinction, almost in a way that really, it reminds me a lot of ideas in Buddhism and Hinduism and yoga about a kind of samadhi, a collapse of subject object into, but it's also mixed with, what do they kind of collapse into? An absorption into basically Platonic ideas. Yeah, so it's definitely not what Kant said. You know, he uses a lot of Kant's aesthetics.
It's also not what the Buddha said.
Yeah, no, definitely not. So it's definitely, but the thing is, it's not necessarily that there's the subject that's operating here, you know, and this kind of the subject of intuition and understanding, I guess. Or can you even say that? I don't know. It's kind of difficult to say, because the one he's talking about here is very, it's definitely strange, I would say, in that he's saying, okay, the subject object distinction is pretty primary as far as these certain principles and conditions that he's talking about over the world of representation. But it's not the most primary thing. But yeah, where does it exactly interact with those other aspects is kind of difficult to comprehend. But I think one thing is, so because Dylan put in the chat, we're divided subjects. So I think that that applies to Schopenhauer in a way that I think would probably be the most sympathetic way to try to make sense of the subject-object distinction that he's doing, where, okay, so anytime I'm conscious of something, I'm having some kind of experience, it's experience of objects. There's something kind of, you know, I have this kind of interior experience. I'm always behind my experience, but it's always of something. It's kind of projected out in front of me. Okay, so that relation, if that always holds, I can never be completely self-conscious in that I can never make the subject an object as a subject. I would just simply be making something like the subject into an object, but then it would no longer be the subject. So there is this division, this fracture in the subject between its objectification, and that's why we can never completely know ourselves because of this. And this is actually something that is also in Kant, but in a quite different way, where Schopenhauer does, this is in his introductory essay where he talks more about this, is I think it's part of the principle of sufficient reason. So that's why he doesn't go into it as much. And that's why it's a little more, it's kind of presented as almost like a matter of fact. But I know at least Kant, he talks about this in a very technical way, that, okay, yeah, if I have empirical, there's an empirical self, but anytime I try to represent the self to myself, it's always in this form of like an empirical self that can never be the transcendental self. So there's this fracture in the I, in the transcendental subject, between its transcendental nature and its empirical nature, which, fun fact, Deleuze likes this, talks a lot about in Difference Repetition. And also I read something about connecting this with Spinoza as well. And that's kind of beside the point. But yeah, I find that idea interesting. And I think that's the best way to try to make sense of what he's saying about the subject and the object, and why it is that, you know, we can never perceive the subject itself, or it can never be an object, because it's kind of this modality that, you know, a kind of phenomenological modality of experience is to have this distinction of subject object. And anytime I can kind of, you know, so maybe that's why also it's not really it's not like there's a substance, like a thing or a being, a person that's kind of, behind your eyes or whatnot, even if it has that impression as kind of how it works, its function. But yeah, at least that's the best way I could make sense of it.
I think I was taking that for granted, that entire schema. I was taking that for granted. Maybe that's the difference in some of the readings that we're having, is that I was taking all of that for granted as just like fact, right? When I was doing the readings, I didn't have any hiccup. I bumped through the first couple of pages like it was not, like I was like, like, okay, yes, the king and the queen, they love each other, they, so on and so forth, kind of like just so storytelling at the very beginning, like, yes, for facts. But I did get the vibe that I don't know, did anyone else, maybe this is another crazy Leibniz, there was, I guess, some Leibniz vibes at some point. Did anyone else have like Leibniz jump into their head during the reading? Because I had Leibniz, like the predications was what I was thinking about.
I don't know
I don't know
much
how
about
to-
Leibniz.
Unfortunate. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
It came to my
So
mind, so I was
what are
hoping
the
there's
many-
somebody here who knew Leibniz that could like, oh yes, this is why your brain mapped that out.
I
That's one
think
of the big
that's,
lacunae in my mind.
yeah, I would like to learn more about Leibniz myself.
Let's read Leibniz.
Yeah,
That was the monadology. It was the monadology. Yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
it's really short.
Yeah, really short. Yeah, it's I read it in undergrad. It was a decent time. But yeah, I had I think there's something about it was, I think for me it was something about, it was the matter section. We were reading about matter here that it brought forward. In particular, like in the Leibniz has the thing about monads having, and like the things that make monads, monad, like a single monad, it is all of its predicates that could be affixed to it, essentially. And in particular, we're talking about like the reason why objects have to be for subjects. Leibniz has this thing where it's like he uses an analogy of like a mirror, and all the things for which we observe in the mirror are essentially predications of that monad, and that monad would not be that monad without all of those predicates. It'd be some other monad. The monad's indivisible. I even have indivisible highlighted here in the text, because that's, I guess, where the monadology kind of hit me. Infinite divisibility is kind of like I think it's infinite divisibility. But yeah, it was like on page 32, but it just kind of reminded me of like the monadology, because the matter, like the activity of the thing is its predication, is essentially what I was thinking. All the ways in which I can talk about its existence in the world. It's is me making its predicating it, and therefore it exists. And if I can't predicate it, then it isn't a thing. It's not a monad. It's not a matter. It's not some object for me to do. And so that's to talk about. So I guess that's why I was thinking about Leibniz, and I potentially have Leibniz all wrong. That was like 3 years ago now. So
I wouldn't.
I haven't looked at him since.
His description of space seems to carry over some of that Leibnizian. It's relational, not absolute.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was something I definitely got. Where I was kind of, and I actually did I think have Leibniz kind of pop in my mind a few times. I'm not, and he mentions Leibniz, I know, throughout this book, as well as a lot of other people. But yeah, that's the thing. So the way that he describes some of these aspects of space and as relational and dynamic, some of that I think he's actually getting from Kant, who also, it is lesser known works kind of where he's trying to ground natural science and physics and whatnot. He talks about natural forces and this kind of dynamics, and also the ether that is this kind of like material substrate of affects that grounds sensation. That's actually his very last work I'm not sure how you say it, like opus postum, or basically the last work he did.
Mm.
A lot of people, I was just reading about this, okay, but so a lot of people are like this is crazy, I don't know what's going on here, but it's pretty interesting, and I think I'm starting to see some aspects of those the kind of dynamics of forces and whatnot with Schopenhauer. And I know Schelling was also influenced by this. So there's one thing where he's talking about there's this oscillation of attraction and repulsion in the ether that causes this vibration, and that's what kind of conditions the ability of something to be affected at all. And because he's trying to come up with, transcendental conditions for, sensation, which is not something he got to in the Critique of Pure Reason. And I think I've seen descriptions in Schopenhauer that seem to, well, I know there's one, he actually quoted it's like Metaphysics of Natural Science, something like that. He actually quoted one of the books, at least about the post-critical stuff on natural science, where he would have been talking about forces and whatnot, Kant. So I think Schopenhauer has that influence, but also there's definitely something of a Leibnizian kind of relational understanding of space, which that is not so much Kantian. So, okay, Kant, there's this debate, Leibniz and Newton.
Mm-hmm.
So Kant sided with Newton. He thought that Newton was right. And he gives various arguments against Leibniz, that it's not about relations of objects and whatnot that give space, or they something like, those predicates of the monads, that's ultimately what's going to give these properties or something, and that's going to be the relations of those will then give you spatial relations. But there's no kind of empty universal container of space like in Newton. That's what Leibniz debated. Where I think Schopenhauer, it's kind of hard to see exactly where he fits with all that, because he seems to kind of obviously sides with Kant on the fact that they're these a priori pure forms of intuition that we have. They're conditions of experience. But at the same time, they also have these aspects of, reciprocal determination of parts and whatnot, even though Kant also has a lot of these things too. If you notice, so a lot of the categories that Kant uses, like substance, and so they're not categories necessarily, but so he talks about, what is it, alteration, the kind of, the analogies of experience, kind of giving things like succession is something. So Schopenhauer uses a lot of those, and he gets a lot of those ideas from Kant. So I think, causality is one of them. Or that's an actual category. But
what I had read about Leibniz was that he explicitly took issue with Newton over absolute time and space, and I don't remember what his writing was, but he literally said, time and space are relative. He actually used the word relative.
Mm-hmm. That's why I was thinking about Einstein a little bit in this, that's why I guess I opened the question about this doesn't seem to be a conflict with the natural science, the dominant view in physics. To the point that my buddy in his PhD program for chemistry is they teach Leibniz the first year to them, because it's, I don't know, Leibniz is being taught still, it's alongside the rest of the stuff. And I was just thinking about Leibniz in because of the space-time, and he uses the word relativity, and in here. So I just was like, okay, well, this seems to be more. This doesn't. And for me, I was like, this doesn't. This seems like a deviation from Kant, but a very subtle one. I was just trying. I don't know really what the how big that subtlety will, what that will result in down the road. But I just kind of didn't know if my sense was completely off there or not. But it sounds like it's kind of accurate.
Yeah, I think so.
I would push back a little bit on Chase when you said between Leibniz and Newton, he sided with Newton. I read him as siding with neither. But agreeing more with Newton on the proper characterization of space, but taking issue with Newton because Newton still holds his characterization of space to be the transcendentally real. What is really real is that we have this empty absolute container of space within which things happen. And Kant is very keen to point out contra Newton that space is not that. It's an ideal form of intuition, not an objective reality that exists for things.
That was part of my argument with Alistair last week, is because I was saying that the relativity of space, the general theory of relativity as an ontological claim is not in conflict with Kant's claim as to the form of our experience. That the form of my experience is very Euclidean, regardless of what the structure of space is. But then Alistair's response to that was that in the Critique of Judgment, which I have not read, that Kant, if I remember him saying something, it's like he can't claims that the actual structure of space and time is Euclidean, but I don't know.
I think there was we didn't talk about this last week. There is a paragraph there where he does mention like triangles and geometry and shit. So yeah. I don't know if that supports it. I don't recall the great details there. But
right. So Euclidean geometry does form a lot of like Kant's arguments for to the transcendental ideality of space and time. He seems to be able to. He seems to think that the certainty and irrefutability of Euclidean geometry supports his thesis. I've read people who said that his whole transcendental idealism falls down in the wake of non-Euclidean geometry and the theory of relativity. I've read other people who have said absolutely not. Like he doesn't hang his whole case for transcendental idealism on
Euclidean geometry.
On Euclidean geometry as such, right?
Wouldn't that? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Go.
Real quickly, I was going to throw in the dispute between Leibniz and Newton. I want to say he characterizes both sides in one of the antinomies, and says kind of more or less that like, yeah, this is logically consistent, and this is logically consistent, and you can't really adjudicate between the two of them because they both assume a transcendental realist perspective.
Yeah. So what I was referring to where Kant sides with Newton, it's in a pre-critical work. I can't remember which one it is, but that's where he gives the argument about the incongruent parts. That's really famous, where I can't have a conceptual determination of left and right hands based purely on the concept. You can have the same concept, but you can have differences. Why? How are those different? They're different in their spatial position. So you need space in order to think of the difference between those concepts to begin with. They presuppose, or I guess, yeah, they require these external spatial relations. I don't know exactly the whole Leibniz Newton thing. I don't know a great deal about it, but I just remember reading that Kant made that argument as an argument against Leibniz or Wolff in favor of Newton at the time. But yeah, the critical work, I think he definitely changed the word. Now he's got something quite different. That's neither. So I agree.
With my understanding too, Chase. Carry on.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things I want to say about non-Euclidean geometry is so for example, take hyperbolic geometry. Well, how do you work with hyperbolic geometry in a in a concrete sense? Well, I don't know if you've ever seen one of these in a physics lab or in a mathematics department, but they'll have a hyperbolic, like if you take a hyperbola and you spin it in 360 dimensions, you get this shape. So you'll actually see these models of I don't know what it's called, but a 3-dimensional hyperbola. And then you can do geometry on, you can literally draw triangles and things on this hyperbolic surface. Or if you talk about spherical geometry, you get a sphere and you draw things on the sphere. What does that tell you? It seems to me it tells you that our intentions are our intuitions are fundamentally Euclidean, and that we can only experience non-Euclidean things through these by mapping them onto Euclidean surfaces. And so again, to me that seems like, my intuitions, my experience is thoroughly Euclidean, regardless of what the world is.
Yeah.
Building on that, I'd like to know more about this too. I've been thinking of it like non-Euclidean geometry is like another order of logic. That in order for it to get off the ground, you have to have a well-established, like a first order and a second order. In order to get non-Euclidean geometry, you're building off of Euclidean geometry, kind of in the way you said, right? First, you have a sphere, and then you imagine what it would be like on the surface of the sphere, where no longer is it true that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But it's already built on like a structure of Euclidean geometry to get to another level, like a second order. I don't know though. I would need some geometers to weigh in, but it seems like one is derivative of the other.
I may just call my buddy up and have him. I may just do it because the guy models chemicals, and so he's always dealing with these. He's dealing with these problems, kind of to a large extent. He does modeling, so I imagine he's done a lot of looking at geometry in the past 4 years.
Yeah. So one thing I think that might be helpful, you put this down my bingo card. So Bergson makes I think he has a good explanation for that kind of, how is it that we have this Euclidean kind of intuition? So what he says that the intellect and matter kind of arose together, and they're generated kind of in this reciprocal fashion where the intellect is kind of made to plan out our action on matter, and it sees it as this kind of pretty similar to the way Schopenhauer kind of sees it as, you have this kind of interactive kind of matrix kind of going on. So what he says that the idea of space in the kind of abstract Euclidean sense, that's kind of taking matter and taking the schema or the matrix that matter kind of has a tendency to show, and kind of pushing that to its limit, where you have a completely abstract representation of what in material just kind of generally follows those things. So it's really kind of a little more complex, because he's got a whole kind of thing going on between space and time also in there. But I think that's kind of helpful to think like, okay, yeah, there's kind of like these, we kind of have the faculty of intellect. It's cut from matter, and matter generally kind of follows a kind of geometric intuition. But the intellect can push that even further to make it, predictable. It can make it, it makes it more rigid, I guess, in a sense too. And that indeed is where you get Euclidean intuitions about things, but it's just a tendency and the limit of a tendency. So you could still have some wiggle room between some kind of Euclidean intuition and also something else, but related to it. So another thing, I used to think that non-Euclidean geometry, that kind of proves Kant wrong in some sense, but I've heard quite a few people argue against that since then, and including Alistair. I remember hearing Alistair say that you could probably still have a kind of general Kantian argument about this intuition of space without necessarily it being completely tied to Euclidean geometry. But there's just like a general intuition of geometry that we get from this kind of a priori intuition of space, which makes sense to me. Sure. I probably disagree with Kant and Schopenhauer that these things are kind of subjective conditions of the mind or whatnot. But I think, there's space is kind of naturally built into how we experience the world, and also seems to be related to geometric intuition of things. So sure, you can go with it. Although Bergson had a much better explanation of it. Because he actually talks about how it's generated.
Before we wrap up, Eric, you mentioned a book earlier in our meeting that when we were talking about Kant, I think. Or no, you talked about Kant, Fichte, Schelling.
Frederick Weiser, German the struggle against subjectivism.
We read an article by him. Tristan, I want to please upload your essay to that Canvas site.
Done. I think it should be done already. I think I did that earlier today. Maybe I started it and then I got like squirreled and then I stopped. That happened to me like a couple times on like 5 different things that I started today. So
okay, it just makes it easier for me to do stuff. Yeah, I see it there now. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome.
I know we're way over time, but I wanted to ask Ed this question. So Ed, you were saying at the very beginning that we can't discover anything, but I guess a question I would ask: how do I discover what this book is independently of my subjective experience of it? Like I mean, if a discovery is discovery of what the thing is independently of my experience, how would I discover what this book is independently of my subjective awareness of it?
I don't know how to answer that because I'm not sure I could do it on an individual basis. I mean, all I was trying to get at is, if what Schopenhauer is saying is true, then shouldn't we banish the word discover the way it is used so many times in science? Lavoisier discovered oxygen, Marie Curie discovered radium, Herschel discovered, I can't remember if it was Neptune or Uranus. Who cares who discovered Pluto, because it's not a planet, but you know what I'm trying to say? So, and there's now, I don't know, over 100 moons of Saturn. And what is the verb that is used frequently is discover, which literally, it seems to me, would imply that there is something and I don't know how to phrase it, in existence before human understanding or experience of it. And
So,
go ahead.
so now Christian made reference to this last time. He said he has reluctantly become a scientific non-realist or anti-realist. So there is a debate in philosophy of science now that's been going on for a very long time, the anti-realists versus the realists. And the realists think, of course, there is an objective world that is independent of our experience of it. It is the absolutely real world, and we have mental impressions of it, and our job is to figure out what that actual real world is in itself. And that's what kind of a transcendental realist thing. There is a real reality outside of our experience. The anti-realists, which are, I don't know if they're scientists, but there are definitely lots of philosophers of science. And what they would say is, and I think actually in terms of Hume, when I say this, what they would say is, like what I would say, I do not live in a physical world. I live in a mental model of a physical world. So what I live in is a mental model which I believe is a fair representation of the world. That's the anti-realist view. And so then, you know, what I tell students is then if you look at the history of science, what the history of science is exactly the construction of mental models and then the testing of those. And so what you do is you say, I have a mental model of the world that says this. Let's do some experiments and see what happens. And if this mental model holds up, oh, look, it doesn't. So for example, the mental model says there is phlogiston. You do some experiments, and what I experience in the model is inconsistent with there being phlogiston. So let's throw phlogiston out of the model. We believe that there is ether because if light is waves, it has to wave in something. We do some experiments. What happens in my mental experience of the world is inconsistent with the existence of that. So we throw that out. We have a conventional model of the world that tells us certain things, but now we have experiences that say that say certain parts of the conventional model are wrong. So we invent these notions of dark matter and dark energy. What are those? Nobody has a fucking clue. Those are placeholders for, we do not know what the hell is going on. And so what happens is, you know, again, this is sort of the anti-realist notion is, we do not live in a physical world. We live in mental, as these guys would say, I live in a set of mental representations. And the best I can do is run experiments. And when what happens in my mental model doesn't fit with what happens, then I have to revise the model. But never mistake the model for the reality. Whatever I experience in my mental model is emphatically not whatever is going on, quote, out there. It is a model that I use to navigate my world, and actually a model that I use for the purposes of scientific experimentation. But it is always and forever a model, because all I have access to are exactly these mental experiences. So that's an anti-realist response to that sort of observation.
So does Pluto exist outside of the mind, the human mind?
We have no way of knowing. I mean, how would you find that out? In order to know if that exists outside the mind, you would have to literally step outside of your subjective awareness, look inside your subjective awareness and go, oh, look, there's the Pluto in my model. And look, there's the Pluto in actual veridical reality. And look, they're the same. But you cannot step out of your subjective awareness. You just can't. And so you can't. And so, you know, the best you can do is construct a model. And, you know, the anti-realists are not idealists. They're not like Schopenhauerian or Hegelian, they really do believe there is a physical world. So in a sense, they're transcendental realists. Models are ever perfect and will never be perfect representations of that transcendental real reality. An idealist would come back and say, if that's the case, why do you think that there is a transcendental reality? Why do you think you're describing the actual transcendental reality at all?
So
Well,
Sit
I-
buoy with it all.
I'm
What's
also dealing with it at a much lower level. I mean, I know automobile is a concept, human being is a concept, auto accident is a concept, but I got T-boned by a car back in 2017, and the person driving the car did not even hit the brakes before she hit me, and my side airbag deployed. I don't think I'm in a catatonic state, curled up in a fetal position in some psychiatric ward right now. I mean, I got hit by a car. I mean, now, could I've experienced that differently than someone else who was driving a similar vehicle, getting T-boned? Sure. I mean, we could experience auto accidents differently. I guess what I'm saying is, we're all assuming we're talking to each other tonight. On what basis?
So, one explanation is called abduction, which is inference to the best explanation. And so, what some people would say is, what some of these anti-realists would say is, the only thing we can experience are our subjective perceptions. But the best explanation for why we have this consistency is that there is a transcendental reality that is giving rise to these subjective perceptions. But the subjective perceptions are not the reality in itself, and they are never going to be a perfect representation. But the best, the inference to the best explanation suggests that a transcendental real world is the best explanation for why we have these consistent experiences. But I think people like Kant and Schopenhauer are going to challenge that. Because remember Kant says he's a transcendental idealist but empirical realist. And so he would say, absolutely, this is a real object. But what real means for Kant is what I experience directly in my empirical awareness. And a condition for me to have this experience of this real thing is for there to be these background transcendental ideal structures of space and time and so on. So, and so the argument goes, it just goes back and forth.
This isn't very sophisticated, but that old expression, one man's heaven is another man's hell.
Haven't heard that.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, you came from a really strict background, so maybe they would no, we reject that. There is one hell, and we know what it is. No, but it's a very old, one man's heaven is another man's hell.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. I have heard that.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, yeah, the experience of it is, I hate this versus I love this, but it is what they're experiencing, even if it's different from each other, subjectively, is quote unquote the same thing.
Yeah, but so here's another simple illustration. So I call this black, and you probably also call this black. But there's no way to know whether what I experience subjectively and what you experience subjectively are the same. I mean, if I was inside your subjective awareness, maybe I would call this red. But the fact is, there's a consistency to our experience, but that doesn't prove that our experiences are ontologically identical. And so, there's I think maybe that's part of what Kant's trying to get to, is there are these structural features of experience that really are universal. But he thinks that the structural features are universal, not because they exist in a transcendental reality outside subjectivity. He thinks that these structures exist because they're sort of imposed by the structure of subjectivity itself. Does that sound right, Eric?
Right. Yeah. The structure of discursive judgment, the subject and the object coming together in a discursive judgment, not necessarily pure subjectivity. imposing time and space and the category so much as it comes from the discursive finite judgment, the subject being in the world. And it's not the subject on its own fully generating a whole world, right? But a subject coming into the object in this particular way, that presupposes, some time and space. And I want to say also, like, I detect, I might be wrong here, but I detect Ed's kind of like, he's pushing against a solipsist consequences of the perceived subjectivism in the transcendental framework that we've started with Kant and Schopenhauer. And at least with Kant, he's not having any truck with solipsism either. He's very keen to point out that we can distinguish between our mere subjective representations and experiences and our experiences of objects, because objects fall under the universal rules given to us by reason, causality, and various other things. And because we all have the same reason, we all understand causality roughly in the same way. We all understand what substance is roughly in the same way. We all operate with the same kind of basic Euclidean geometry in the way we understand space, because we're all on the same page on these fronts. We can regard our experiences as experiences of objects and not mere play of the mind's fantasy.
But for Kant, so for a transcendental realist, the reason that these structures have, are objective is because there is an objective material world outside any subjectivity. And so the reason that all these things, space, time, and objects are objective is because they exist independently of the subject. But for the transcendental idealist, it's because, and correct me again if I'm wrong, it's because every rational subject orders experience in exactly the same way, because rationality is by its nature universal. Rationality produces universal structures like logic, geometry, mathematics, and so on. And so it's the rational structuring of experience that gives rise to the universal objectivity of experience.
Yeah, I would qualify just a little bit. Because Kant holds out for the possibility of what God's rationality would look like, and his intellectual intuition, his Kant's version of intellectual intuition, very different from Schopenhauer. So I would say Kant thinks God is rational, but God doesn't experience the world in a discursive way as like we do. So God is not necessarily subject to the constraints of time and space and experiencing the world. However, we, finite subjects with reason, must experience the world and judge the world discursively, for which we must have a prior idea of time and space.
Yeah, both you and Chase corrected me last time. So that what I said was true for finite rational subjects.
Right. Which is, I think it's important to get that across, because Kant is very clear. Part of Kant's project is to kind of build an epistemology starting with the finitude, where I think previous philosophers were trying to get an Archimedean point, a transcendental perspective. They're not starting with their finitude, but trying to take again, Spinoza's phrase, sub specie aeternis, right? To what does the world like from the eternal perspective? Kant says, hell no, you can't understand that. You're not an eternal being, right? So what does the world like from our what does the world look like from our limited finite perspective? And then how can we support a whole Newtonian physics? Because if we limit ourselves to our finite perspective, it's very easy to fall into Hume. And we have no longer the necessity of cause. And then we don't understand how Newton's not just an approximation, a rule of thumb, that may change over time. I guess we can look now at mostly an approximation, but there's something more to it. I think there is something of necessity. That was Kant's intuition anyway. There's something of necessity and cause, which Hume flatly denies. But how do you get that necessity? from a finite perspective.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Hmm.
Thanks very much.
I'm tempted to launch into a attack of subjective epistemology as the starting point, but it's really late, so probably not.
There is mac and cheese calling my name, guys. Very childish, call there, but mac and cheese is calling the name.
Which days can you bring that up next week?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well, don't forget it.
May have to remind me.
That's it's not. At first I was going to say you're going to do object-oriented epistemology.
No.
One thing I was going to throw out too is because it seems like for me Kant is very much strictly epistemological in the Critique of Pure Reason, and Schopenhauer is already ontologizing.
Mhm. No, I can see that. Yeah. Quit opening cans of worms as we're trying to leave, man. That's a good one. I like that one. Can we start on that one next week? Can we start on that? Can we start on that? That Chase and Eric, can we start on that?
You just think that mac and cheese is calling you. It's really not.
I mean, immediately, the temptations of the body gone, and the temptations of the intellect, forward.
It's really not mac and cheese. It's the poop of some transcendental animal.
Yes.
So.
Transcendental poop.
Yum. I'm reading. Okay, now I'm being tempted by the body again. So there we go.
Isn't this perfect like episodic storytelling? You're supposed to leave with something to come back to.
Yes. Always.
Cliffhanger.
So it's just one dream amongst many.
Right.
All right, guys.
You guys are
Have a
going to
nice
leave my dream.
weekend.
Bye-bye.